bumped my seat on purpose.
It was an accident. Calm down. Ma'am, please, let's resolve this calmly.
This is ridiculous.
Flight 447 from Denver to Los Angeles was scheduled to depart at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. The aircraft was a Boeing 737, newly renovated, with 156 seats filled by passengers eager to reach their destinations. Among them was Marcus Williams, a black software engineer from Seattle who had booked his seat 6 months in advance. Seat 12C, a window seat in business class that he had earned through his hard-earned salary and frequent flyer miles. Marcus was dressed impeccably in business. Casual, carrying a leather laptop bag, his demeanor professional and calm. He had flown hundreds of times, and this was supposed to be a routine flight to Los Angeles for a tech conference where he was scheduled to speak about artificial intelligence and machine learning. But today would be different. Today, his right to sit in a seat he had legally purchased would be challenged. Today, the captain of the aircraft would make a decision that would reverberate through the aviation industry and challenge everything we thought we knew about authority, justice, and the cost of taking a stand. Subscribe to Echo Story for stories that expose discrimination in real time and celebrate those who refuse to tolerate injustice. Like this video, if you believe that standing up for what's right sometimes requires sacrificing everything. Marcus took his seat at 2:35 p.m., completely unaware that the next 45 minutes would change his life and the lives of everyone aboard this aircraft forever. Robert Patterson, a white businessman in his mid-50s, boarded Flight 447 at 2:40 p.m. He wore an expensive suit, carried himself with the entitlement of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, and made a beeline for business class. He stopped at seat 12B directly next to Marcus, and his expression immediately shifted. He looked at Marcus with visible disdain, as if the presence of a black man in business class was an error that needed correcting. Instead of taking his assigned seat in 12B, Robert turned and walked toward the flight attendant station. He spoke loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "There's been a mistake with my seating. I need to be moved. I'm not sitting next to that." He gestured dismissively at Marcus without even looking at him. His meaning was unmistakable. The flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, looked uncomfortable. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He had experienced discrimination before, but it never got easier, never stopped hurting. Robert's words had transformed him from a passenger with a ticket into a problem that needed solving. Sarah approached Marcus awkwardly and whispered, "I'm so sorry, but this gentleman is requesting a seat change. Would you be willing to move?" Marcus's hands trembled with rage. He had done nothing wrong. He had broken no rules. He was sitting in a seat he had paid for, a seat that was legally his. And yet, he was being asked to move because of his race. Marcus looked Sarah in the eye and said quietly, "No, I'm not moving. I paid for this seat. I have a right to sit here." His voice was calm, but his hands shook with the adrenaline of standing his ground. Sarah looked trapped between duty and justice. She knew that what Robert was asking for was discrimination. But airline culture often prioritized passenger satisfaction above principles. She excused herself and walked toward the cockpit. Robert, emboldened by his previous success in getting attention, began making a scene. He said loudly to anyone who would listen, "I'm not flying next to a black man. This is ridiculous. Airlines need to have standards." Other passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, unwilling to engage. One older white man actually nodded in agreement with Robert. But a young Asian woman across the aisle stood up and said sharply, "That's racist and you know it. Sit down." Robert turned red, his rage building. He said to Sarah, who had returned from the cockpit, "Either this man moves or I'm getting off this plane." Sarah, looking genuinely distressed, said, "Sir, we cannot force a passenger to move from his assigned seat based on race. That would be illegal." Robert's face contorted with anger. "Then get the captain. I want to speak to the captain immediately." Captain Michael Torres emerged from the cockpit. He was a 58-year-old man with 34 years of flying experience, a reputation for fairness, and a visible commitment to doing the right thing. He had flown with diverse crews, had hired diverse pilots, and had built a career on principle rather than convenience. As he approached Seat 12B and assessed the situation, he immediately understood what was happening. Robert explained his demand. He wanted Marcus moved because he was uncomfortable sitting next to a black man. Robert's words were bold, unapologetic, deliberately racist. Captain Torres listened without interrupting. Then he did something extraordinary. He looked directly at Robert and said, "Sir, I'm going to be very clear about what's happening here. You are asking me to discriminate against a paying passenger based solely on his race. I will not do that. You have 3 options. Sit in your assigned seat, take a different available seat if one exists that doesn't require moving this passenger, or you can deplane and take a later flight." Robert's face turned purple with rage. He said, "You're choosing a black man over a paying passenger? I demand to speak to the airline." Captain Torres replied, "I am the airline while we are in the air. This is my aircraft, and discrimination is not tolerated on my aircraft. You have 2 minutes to decide." Robert stormed off, screaming about lawsuits and complaints. He went to the gate agent, demanding that he be allowed to deplane with a full refund. The gate agent, aware that the captain had already made his decision, approved the request. But then something unexpected happened. As Robert prepared to exit the aircraft, Captain Torres made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Michael Torres. We have a situation that requires my attention. I'm going to address it directly." He made his way to the center of the cabin, and the aircraft fell silent. A passenger on this flight has asked another passenger to move seats based on race. I have informed him that discrimination is not tolerated on this aircraft. He has chosen to deplane. However, I want to be very clear. This aircraft will not depart for Los Angeles as scheduled. Instead, we are going to remain here for the next 45 minutes. During that time, I want every passenger to understand something fundamental. Discrimination is not a personal preference. It is a crime. It is a violation of federal law. It is a betrayal of the principles that this country claims to stand for. He paused, letting his words settle. If anyone else on this aircraft shares this passenger's belief that they should not sit near someone of a different race, I'm asking you to deplan. People who believe that discrimination is acceptable. The cabin was absolutely silent. Captain Torres's words hung in the air, challenging every passenger to examine their own prejudices, their own complicity, their own willingness to tolerate injustice. No other passengers moved to deplane. Instead, something extraordinary began to happen. Passengers started applauding. The applause grew louder, becoming a standing ovation. Marcus, sitting in seat 12C, felt tears stream down his face. He was crying not from relief, but from the shock of having someone in power choose justice over convenience, choose principle over profit. Captain Torres returned to the flight deck and began the pre-departure checklist. At 3:32 p.m., exactly 45 minutes after Captain Torres's announcement, Flight 447 pushed back from the gate and began taxiing. The aircraft was no longer just a commercial flight. It had become a symbol. It had become a moment where one person's decision had prioritized human dignity above everything else. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, news of what had happened began to spread. Passengers were filming, posting, sharing. The hashtag #JoshCaptainsTruth was already trending on social media. By the time Flight 447 reached 30,000 feet, the story was national news. Marcus, sitting in his seat staring out the window, felt the weight of what had just happened. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. He hadn't wanted to be at the center of a national conversation about racism. He had simply wanted to sit in a seat he had paid for, on a flight he had booked months in advance. But Captain Torres's decision had transformed his quiet act of refusal into something monumental. He looked at his phone and saw over 500 notifications. His mother had called. His sister had texted. His friends were sending messages congratulating him for standing his ground. News organizations were trying to reach him for interviews. Hashtags with his name were trending. The video of Robert's outburst and Captain Torres's response had already been viewed 10 million times. Marcus was no longer just a passenger. He was now the symbol of every person who had ever been discriminated against and forced to accept it silently. He was the face of the cost of doing nothing, the price of tolerance. But more importantly, He was witnessing what happened when someone in a position of power chose justice. Captain Torres, by making that decision, had risked his career, had risked the airline's schedule, had risked financial consequences. And he had done it anyway because it was the right thing to do. Within hours of Flight 447 landing in Los Angeles, the airline's corporate office was in crisis mode. The CEO held an emergency press conference where she announced that the airline fully supported Captain Torres's decision. She said, "What happened on Flight 447 represents a defining moment for our company. Captain Torres made the right choice. He prioritized human dignity over convenience. We are committed to ensuring that every passenger on every flight feels safe and respected regardless of their race, color, creed, or national origin." The statement seemed supportive, but corporate America had learned that merely supporting justice wasn't enough. Actions had to follow. The airline announced a $50 million investment in diversity and inclusion training for all staff. They committed to implementing new protocols for handling discrimination complaints. They promised that any employee who engaged in or facilitated discrimination would be terminated. But the most significant announcement was this: the airline was creating a new position, Vice President of Dignity and Inclusion, and they were offering Captain Torres a promotion to that position if he wanted it. Captain Torres declined the offer. He said that he wanted to keep flying, that his place was in the cockpit, that he had done what he believed was right and expected no reward for it. That response, the refusal of corporate validation, the commitment to continuing to do the right thing regardless of recognition, became the defining moment of Captain Torres's character. The FAA opened an investigation into Robert Patterson's conduct. What they discovered was that Robert had a history of similar incidents. Over the past 5 years, he had been involved in 7 different discrimination complaints on various airlines. Each time he had demanded that black passengers move. Twice, airlines had actually accommodated his request. Once, a passenger had been forcibly removed by security for refusing to move. Robert's behavior had been enabled by an airline industry that prioritized passenger satisfaction above justice. But now, with Captain Torres's decision having changed the calculus, airlines were no longer willing to accommodate discrimination. Industry leaders issued statements condemning Robert's behavior. The International Air Transport Association released new guidelines emphasizing that discrimination would not be tolerated. Airlines began announcing their own diversity initiatives, not because they suddenly discovered morality, but because the market had punished the airline for allowing discrimination and rewarded it for standing against it. Robert, meanwhile, faced a firestorm. His social media accounts were flooded with messages of outrage. His employer, a major financial services company, suspended him pending an investigation into his conduct. Professional organizations that he belonged to expelled him. His wife filed for divorce, stating that she couldn't remain married to someone who would publicly demand racial discrimination. Robert's life imploded not because the government punished him, but because society rejected him. A documentary filmmaker named James reached out to Marcus and Captain Torres about creating a film about the incident and its ripple effects across the aviation industry. Both initially resisted. Neither wanted to be famous, neither wanted their moment of principle to be commodified. But eventually, they agreed, understanding that a documentary could serve an educational purpose. The documentary, titled The Captain's Choice, premiered at Sundance Film Festival and was later acquired by Netflix. It featured interviews with Marcus and Captain Torres, with the passengers who witnessed the incident, with other pilots who had similar stories of standing against discrimination, with Robert Patterson, who was remorseful but not forgiven, and with experts on systemic racism in the aviation industry. The documentary asked hard questions. Why was discrimination so prevalent in airlines? How many other Robert Pattersons had been accommodated by airlines? How many other Marcus Williamses had been forced to move? Why did it take one captain's moral stand to expose a systemic problem? The documentary was nominated for multiple Academy Awards and became required viewing in business schools, diversity training programs, and aviation training academies. It transformed Captain Torres into an unlikely folk hero and Marcus into a symbol of quiet resistance. 3 months after the incident, Captain Torres sat in his office reviewing hate mail. Thousands of messages had flooded in from people who felt that he had been politically correct gone mad, that he had overstepped his authority, that he should have just let the airline accommodate Robert's request. Some messages were viciously racist, threatening violence against him or his family. The FAA had assigned security detail to him. Airlines had received threats of boycotts from people claiming that they would never fly on an airline that didn't allow passengers to choose who sat next to them. Captain Torres realized that standing on principle had come at a cost. He had received death threats. His family had been harassed. People who had previously respected him now saw him as a traitor to whiteness, as someone who had chosen a black stranger over his own race. The psychological toll was significant. Captain Torres had PTSD from the threats. He struggled with guilt, wondering if his decision had been worth the consequences. His therapist helped him understand that this was the reality of fighting systemic racism. There were always costs, always backlash, always people who felt that their privilege was being threatened. But the alternative, accepting discrimination, accommodating racism, choosing convenience over justice, was something Captain Torres could never do. So he continued flying, continued standing against discrimination, and continued bearing the costs of doing so. 6 months after the incident, Congress held hearings on discrimination in the aviation industry. Captain Torres and Marcus were invited to testify. They sat before Congress and told their story. Captain Torres spoke about the systemic nature of discrimination in aviation, about the way that airlines had historically accommodated racist passengers, about the need for federal legislation to make it clear that discrimination would not be tolerated. Marcus spoke about the moment when he had to choose between his comfort and his dignity, about the calculation he had to make regarding whether standing his ground might result in violence, about the relief he felt when Captain Torres chose justice. Congress members expressed outrage at what they heard. Some called for Robert Patterson to be criminally prosecuted. Others called for federal legislation establishing clear penalties for discrimination in transportation. By the end of the hearings, there was broad consensus that federal action was needed. Congress began drafting the Aviation Dignity Act, legislation that would establish federal standards for handling discrimination complaints, create federal penalties for discrimination, and create federal protections for employees who refused to participate in discrimination. The legislation would not have been necessary if the aviation industry had simply chosen to do the right thing voluntarily. By the 9-month mark after the incident, the aviation industry had undergone a complete transformation. Airlines announced new policies explicitly prohibiting discrimination and establishing clear procedures for handling complaints. Training programs on racism and unconscious bias became mandatory for all staff. New hiring practices were implemented to ensure that people who held discriminatory views didn't work in customer-facing roles. Airlines began tracking and publicly reporting on incidents of discrimination. Most importantly, a new culture began to emerge where employees felt empowered to refuse to participate in discrimination, where passengers felt safe reporting racist behavior, where companies prioritized justice over customer satisfaction. Captain Torres received invitations from airlines around the world, asking him to consult on their diversity initiatives. He declined most of them, but occasionally he would volunteer his time to help other airlines implement genuine systemic change. He became known as the captain who had chosen principle over profit, who had risked everything to stand against discrimination. But Captain Torres was careful not to accept praise for what he saw as simply doing his job, which was to protect all passengers and treat them with equal dignity. 1 year after the incident, Marcus received a letter from Robert Patterson. Robert had spent months in therapy, trying to understand the racism that had driven him to demand that Marcus move. The letter was not a request for forgiveness. Instead, Robert wrote about his own journey toward understanding his racism, about the privilege he had never questioned before, about the shame he felt for his actions. He wrote, "I know nothing I say will make up for what I did. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that your willingness to stand your ground and Captain Torres's decision to support you forced me to confront the racism inside myself. I've spent the last year trying to understand how I became someone who would publicly demand racial discrimination. The answer is uncomfortable. I had never been forced to see my racism. I had been accommodated by airlines, by society, by people who enabled my prejudice. Your stand and the captain's stand finally forced me to see myself clearly. I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry. And I'm dedicating the rest of my life to working against the racism that I once embodied. Marcus read the letter multiple times. He did not forgive Robert. But he understood that Robert's journey toward accountability, while not redemptive, was significant. Robert had actually changed. He had examined his racism, had worked to dismantle it, and was now educating others about the dangers of the racism he had once embodied. This was what genuine accountability looked like, not just punishment, but transformation. 18 months after the incident, Congress passed the Aviation Dignity Act. The bill, signed into law by the President, established federal standards for handling discrimination in aviation, created federal penalties for discrimination up to $500,000 per violation, and established federal protections for employees who refused to participate in discrimination. The bill also created a federal registry of incidents of discrimination, allowing patterns to be tracked across airlines. Most importantly, the bill explicitly stated that airlines could not require passengers to move from assigned seats based on race, color, creed, national origin, or protected characteristics. The bill bore the fingerprints of Marcus's case, of Captain Torres's decision, of the public outrage that had followed. Captain Torres was invited to the signing ceremony at TWA's, the White House. The President spoke directly to him. Captain Torres, you made a choice that cost you personally. You faced threats, harassment, and backlash. But your choice created a moment that changed the aviation industry and led to this legislation. You put your career, your safety, and your reputation on the line for a principle. This nation is better because of your courage. Captain Torres, visibly moved, said simply, I just did my job, Mr. President. I protected my passengers. I treated them with equal dignity. That should be the standard, not the exception. Captain Torres's decision sparked a broader reckoning across industries. Hotels began examining their profiling practices. Restaurants began training staff on how to handle racist customers. Retail stores began establishing policies against discrimination. Universities began examining how security treated students of color. The realization that systemic racism wasn't just an individual problem but a systemic one began to spread throughout American business. Companies that had previously claimed commitment to diversity suddenly discovered that they needed to implement actual policies, actual training, actual accountability. Marcus received countless invitations to speak at universities, at corporate events, at conferences. He declined most of them, preferring to live a quiet life. But occasionally he would speak about his experience, about the moment when he had to choose between moving and standing his ground, about the relief he felt when Captain Torres chose justice. He spoke about Captain Torres as a hero, but Torres always resisted that characterization. He would say, I'm not a hero, I just did what should have been obvious. Marcus is the hero. He stood his ground, he risked violence, risked being arrested, risked his reputation. I simply backed him up. That's what leaders are supposed to do. 2 years after the incident, Captain Torres sat in his home reflecting on everything that had happened. He had become something he never wanted to be. Famous, controversial, symbolic. He had received job offers from airlines around the world. He had received offers from corporate consulting firms. He had received offers from entertainment companies wanting to make a movie about his decision. He had declined them all. He continued flying, continued standing against discrimination, and continued bearing the costs of his principle. But the question that haunted him was one that no one could answer. How many Captain Torres moments would it take to truly dismantle systemic racism? His one decision had sparked change, had inspired legislation, had transformed an industry. But discrimination persisted. It simply took new forms, hid behind new language, adapted to new realities. The victory he had won was significant but incomplete. The question that kept him awake at night was whether victory would ever be complete, whether systemic racism could truly be dismantled, whether future generations would have to fight the same battles he had fought. Captain Torres's own father, now 85 years old, sat with his son and watched footage of the incident. His father had been born in Puerto Rico and had experienced explicit, violent racism in 1950s America. He had seen no colored signs, had been refused service at restaurants, had been beaten by police for being in the wrong neighborhood. He wept as he watched his son stand against discrimination in the supposedly enlightened 21st century. "I thought things would be better for your generation," his father said softly. Captain Torres held his father's hand. "They are better, Papa. We don't have segregation laws. We don't have explicitly racist signs. But the racism is still there. It's just hidden, systemic, harder to see but no less real. Maybe the fact that I had to make this decision at all shows how far we still have to go." His father nodded. "I'm proud of you, mijo. I'm so proud of you. And I'm angry that you even had to do this. We deserve better. Your children deserve better." 3. Years after the incident, Marcus and Captain Torres met for coffee. They had become unlikely friends, bound by the moment when one had stood his ground and the other had supported him. Marcus had started a consulting firm dedicated to helping companies implement genuine diversity initiatives. Captain Torres had established the Torres Foundation for Dignity in Transportation, dedicated to supporting employees who faced retaliation for refusing to participate in discrimination. Together, they had helped dozens of airlines implement real systemic change. But both knew that the work was far from finished. Marcus said to Captain Torres, "You changed my life that day. But you also changed your own life. I want you to know how much I appreciate what you risked." Captain Torres replied, "You changed your life that day too. You stood your ground. You refused to internalize the shame that Robert tried to place on you. That took courage." Subscribe to Echo Story for stories about real people who refuse to accept injustice, who stand their ground, and who inspire systemic change. Both men understood that their moment was now part of history, part of the narrative of how America slowly, painfully, reluctantly was learning to treat all people with dignity. 5 years after the moment that changed everything, Captain Michael Torres stood at the age of 63, preparing for what might be his final flight before retirement. He had flown for 39 years, had served as captain for the last 15 years, and had made thousands of flights. But this one would be special. Flight 447 from Denver to Los Angeles, the same route he had flown 5 years ago, the same flight where he had made the decision that changed his life. As Captain Torres entered the cockpit and prepared for departure, he thought about Robert Patterson, who had died 6 months earlier from a heart attack, but not before spending his final years in quiet redemption, working against the racism he had once embodied. He thought about Marcus, who had gone on to speak to millions of people about the importance of standing against discrimination. He thought about the Aviation Dignity Act, which had prevented thousands of incidents of discrimination. He thought about the fact that discrimination still persisted, that the fight was far from over, that future generations would have to continue the work of dismantling systemic racism. As Flight 447 pushed back from the gate, Captain Torres made an announcement. "Good afternoon, passengers. This is Captain Michael Torres. I want to welcome you aboard Flight 447 to Los Angeles. I've flown this route many times, but this flight is special. 5 years ago, on this exact route, something happened that changed my life and, I believe, changed our industry. A passenger was asked to move from his seat because of his race. I refused to accommodate that discrimination. Today I want to remind everyone that every passenger on this aircraft has the right to sit in the seat they paid for, to be treated with dignity, and to expect that this aircraft will never tolerate discrimination. We are committed to that principle. We are committed to treating all passengers with equal respect. Thank you for flying with us." As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, Captain Torres felt the weight of 5 years of fighting for justice, of bearing the costs of principle, of standing against discrimination. And he felt something else too. Hope. Not naive hope that racism was solved, but genuine hope that the work was possible, that change was real. That one person's decision to do the right thing could ripple outward and transform an entire industry. The question that remained was whether that change would be enough, whether the momentum would continue, whether future generations would carry forward the commitment to treating all people with dignity. That uncertainty, more than any victory, was what kept Captain Torres flying, fighting, demanding better.